Okay.
Everything from people being seated on the bench down there to law enforcement officials, and kind of them deflecting quite a bit. When we think back, when Vandersloot was incarcerated, even initially in this thing, it was for a very short time on the island down there. And so, you know, being here in the U.S. and being here in the southern part of the United States, this made pretty big news. As you know, my university is based in Alabama. Uh, the Holloway story has been followed very, very carefully down here and closely over the years. And um, it just really seemed like, to use a metaphor, that the family was kind of spitting in the ocean to try to raise the water level. It didn't do too much good. And uh, it would seem as though at this point in time that maybe they have a spark of hope. I don't know how much hope, and I think that we can get into that. But I'm hopeful that it will be her, but I still have my doubts.
Well, let's talk about that hope, and that hope remains in these human remains. So let's talk about this. What kind of tests would actually be performed on these human remains? We're talking about if it really is Natalee Holloway, you have a decomposed remains from over 12 years ago. So what kind of tests
Right.
would people perform on this?
I think it's going to be important for us to back up a little bit, Jesse, relative to this, and think about the environment in which let's just refer to them as so-called human remains at this point in time. And this goes back to this idea of this taking place on Aruba. Um, there are very few in the United States truly board certified forensic anthropologists here. I'm curious as to who they went to on the island down there that identified these as initially human remains. Now, more than likely, they are human remains. But from there begins this whole kind of cycle going forward. How these remains were processed down there, how they were initially handled, how many hands have they passed through, and this sort of thing. And that's going to play a big part in this. Let's keep in mind that probably number one on everybody's mind is the idea of conducting DNA tests. And DNA is a very, very sensitive test that will have to be pursued here. The environment down in Aruba, it's not like and talking geographically and meteorologically now, it's not like a typical Caribbean island. If you look at just the vegetation down there, it's very it's scrub-like, a lot of cactus growing everywhere. It's more like our desert Southwest. So therefore, any kind of remains that are down there are going to have a tendency to be very well desiccated, uh, compromised to a great degree. In one of the pieces that I saw in the media, the remains were allegedly found in a burlap sack. That doesn't provide too much protection in this particular case. So, if you're going for things like DNA, if you're looking in the long bones, they would go after bone marrow. If there is a skull involved and the teeth are intact, which the teeth should still be intact, they would try to extract DNA from the pulp of the tooth. When Just to kind of break it down for the audience so that they understand, when I'm teaching my college classes, people will ask this question about how do we harvest DNA if we don't have like a wet sample like blood or saliva or semen or something like this. Well, it gets a bit more tricky at that point in time. Imagine, if you will, if you have a bone. A bone is kind of like a canvas backpack that is transporting DNA. A tooth is more like a steel briefcase, okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's transporting DNA. So it can be much more resilient, but still in this environment, I think that they're going to have a very difficult time finding a full intact strand of DNA. So they're going to have to rely on what we refer to as a chain reaction test. It's PCR test that's out there where it kind of replicates itself. It's kind of like making a photocopy, if you will, to identify the strain compared with familial DNA that they'll take from the dad.
Do you anticipate that it really will take several weeks to determine if this is Natalee or not? Does something take that long?
I, you know, Jesse, it's going to be dependent upon whose hands this has gone into. This goes to a bigger overall point, and I hate to keep returning to this,
No
but
worries.
keep in mind, I'm a I'm a forensics guy. I believe in limited chain of custody. I'm a guy that believes in, the idea of too many fingers in the pot spoil the soup, that sort of thing. Um, I think my question here is, first off, how how were these remains, after they were identified as human remains, how were they transported out of the country? Okay,
Hmm.
how did they make it through customs out of that country down there? Then how did they make it? And I'm assuming that they've come to the U.S. How did they make it through our customs here? Who handled them? What conveyance was used? And then who were they conveyed to? Now, I would imagine that it more than likely it will be some esteemed DNA scientist. And if it's a private case, which at this point in time it is, it's not like this is going to be handled, by the FBI or something. They've put this into the hands of a private lab, probably. Maybe the FBI will consult on it. But now this is more not so much a forensics case, but if you think of it as almost like I don't know, something like antiques or art where you're trying to judge provenance on something. How many hands has it passed through? Is it legitimate? Is it valid? Because now you're not looking for a criminal prosecution. And even if they do get her identified down there, I don't necessarily think that this is going to, prompt anything down there. I don't want to go too far afield with this, but again, if these remains were not in forensics, we have this construct of examining something in situ. Okay, and for those at home, that means in place, in its original place, in its pristine condition. Because it's only then can we appreciate kind of what happened. If you take that evidence out of context, it's really hard to examine it. Let's say the bones have now been compromised in their normal anatomical position, which I would assume that they have been by now. You couldn't appreciate them in their full form. Whereas we would process and excavate a grave here, take a lot of time with it. And then before you ever got to DNA, one of the crucial things here is to determine, well, what actually traumatically happened to these bones. I don't know if that exam was conducted down there. Was there head trauma? One of the pieces that I've seen has indicated that this so-called, confidential informant mentioned that her leg was broken and she was placed into the bag. Um, did they examine this? Who examined it? There's a lot of questions with this. And so, as far as the DNA exam goes, I think that they're going to want to take their time. And yeah, I could see how they would want to test this multiple times just to make sure that they've covered all of the bases.
Especially since we're dealing with the Natalee Holloway case. This is a
Oh,
case that's been
absolutely.
so.
Yeah, as you well know, the lights will never have shone brighter.
Of course, of
This is
course.
this is a huge story.
It's a huge story if it works, if it turns out that it is her for the family and for the world at large, because they've been captured by this case for 12 years. But just so I understand, the viewers understand, you're saying that if, let's say we limit the chain of custody for how many people were actually handling this remains, if the
Right.
remains were actually in a way preserved in as optimal condition as possible, is it possible that you could at least maybe determine the cause of death of this person? I mean, have you dealt with cases where you've had remains that have been discovered years later and you are able to determine what happened to this person? Is it possible?
Yes, it is possible. Answering that question directly, yes, it is possible. However, keep in mind, the lion's share of cases that we deal with in the medical legal community, though we do deal with a lot of skeletal remains, most of the stuff that we deal with has soft tissue remaining, right? So we can look at things like contusions and gunshot wounds and sharp force injury wounds. And, you think about choking deaths, like manual strangulations and all these kinds of things where we have petechiae. None of that stuff exists. After 12 years, I promise you, in this environment, if there is any soft tissue, you could knock me over with a feather. So we're completely reliant on the skeleton at this point in time, and any trauma is there. Now, this will be kind of interesting. If she were alive, say for instance, and she was traumatized, say in a torture where she was still left alive after bones were broken and this sort of thing, there is an odd peripheral chance that we could have hemorrhage uh, on the bone or just within the surface of the bone. That would be an indication that she had sustained this trauma in life. If the bones were broken, that sort of thing, broken ribs, you can appreciate that sometimes. But Jesse, we're so far downrange here. I don't have a lot of hope. I do hope it for the Holloway family, but I don't have a lot of hope at this point.
No, I completely understand. Again, we're dealing with remains that have been in that environment for years. And as you said, it's not as when you have a body that is fresh and you're able to determine what happened, and especially in those island conditions, which we will talk about in a minute. But I do, while I have you here, I have to ask you the million-dollar question that many people would be wondering. Obviously, there's been talk, and then prime suspect is Joran van der Sloot. Would you be able to determine from those remains any kind of indication of a fingerprint, DNA, something other than the remains themselves to indicate that she was touched or attacked or somehow in relation to another individual? Would there be other remains on there? I know we've talked about it. You talked about the conditions of people handling it, and it's so decomposed, but I am curious.
Yeah. Okay. Again, let me go into teacher mode real quick.
Please do.
When you begin to think about this idea of tying things back, okay, in forensics, we have a term that we use that's called individualization, and this transfers over into the court. That is, can we tie a specific suspect back through physical evidence relative to a specific event, say, head trauma, sexual assault, all these sorts of things. As time goes by, as we move further and further away down our linear timeline in the construct of crime or this event, things begin to fade and pass like memories do. Okay, so you're going to lose a lot of that. Now, a lot of people think about this idea of, say, for instance, people really get excited over the construct of touch DNA this, touch DNA that. And it is fantastic. It's a fantastic tool. It's going to change the way crime fighting takes place in America. However, in this case, you're not going to have left behind remnant, say for instance, of touch DNA. Touch DNA happens when skin cells are sloughed off, and again, you only get a fragment of that DNA strand that has to be replicated, generally through PCR, and you can tie somebody back to that. It's very difficult to do because let's just think about it. Particularly, everybody taking a look at this. If you think about random skin cells, sloughing skin cells that have fallen off of someone, think about how fragile talcum powder is. We put talcum powder in our hands and we blow it. There might still be a remnant here, but for the most part, it's going to be gone away. And over a longer period of time, even that residual amount will be gone away. DNA is about 10 times more fragile or 100 times more fragile than that.
Right.
It's very, very fragile. Fingerprints, no, unless there is some kind of well-preserved object that is in the this conveyance with her. But again, I think back to people got all, I don't know if you recall this, but I guess it was probably last year when they were demolishing O.J. Simpson's home, and some cop came forward and said that he had recovered a knife in the yard.
Yes.
He's retired now. They had the knife. Everybody was asking. I can't tell you how many shows I went on. Everybody wanted to know, oh, are we going to be able to find DNA on this knife, and so forth and so on. And you just can't. It's so very, very fragile. So it'd be very difficult. This goes back to this idea of the nylon suitcase representing the bone, and the steel briefcase carrying, which represents the tooth, carrying that DNA. It has to be preserved like that. At this point in time, as far as identification goes, the teeth will be the key. Now, back to a signature, as far as if this van der Sloot character is involved in this, and he has a history of violence against women, and he engages in particular type of trauma with women. If they can prove this, maybe her teeth have been knocked out, maybe certain bones in her body. that would leave, as profilers might say, a signature event that's behind. But again, it's not hard, concrete forensic evidence.
Right, and just to tell our viewers, it was 5 years after Holloway's disappearance that Vandersloot, pled guilty to killing Peruvian business student Stephanie Flores Ramirez. So as you said, that was a situation where that's his signature or his calling card, you might be able to see it. But I do want to switch gears with you a little bit.
Sure.
How would someone on that island, how would someone have killed, how would someone have killed NATALEE and disposed or concealed her remains for so long? You look at those island conditions. What is it about that? And we've talked about this before. One of the problems for investigators, it was such a large search area, How would someone, I know it's a tricky question, but how would someone have maybe had, killed NATALEE and removed her remains or was able to conceal it for such a long time? I'm curious about what those island conditions might present.
I think it's a good question, Jesse. I think common sense would dictate that. Obviously, what's going to be our leading suspect here uh, as far as concealing a body? Well, there's not too many hollow trees down there to hide bodies in.
Right.
I would assume there's not many abandoned buildings because of the price of real estate. So the one thing that you've got left, unless you can get the body out to sea, which I always kind of thought might happen. I'm originally from Louisiana, so I worked a lot of cases in the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
Or the body was burned, or spirited off of the island in some way, some conveyance, a boat or plane or something like this. Lastly, we come to burial. And I think that if you have limited resources, you're trying to dispose of a body in a quick manner. That's generally the number one contender. Uh, and you would have to have a group of people, though, if he's working by himself. It's one thing, but if he's working with a group of people to facilitate this, you have a group of people that are willing to keep their mouths shut. And then a secluded area, which, yeah, the search area was big, but let's think about it. It's Aruba. I mean, we've got counties in our states here that are, 4 times the size of the island of Aruba in some places, probably. So it's not huge. It's not like working a case in West Texas or something. Um, so there's only a few places that the body could be placed, and I would think that burial would be number one. Most criminals or perpetrators that dispose of bodies make these mistakes many times. That's how we catch them. It's not that we're incredibly bright. I'm speaking for myself, of course, not my colleagues. It's just that people don't think about things. They're in a frenetic rush that they just want to get distance between themselves and the bodies and place the bodies out of sight, out of mind. I'm amazed that it's taken this long, 12 years, on this small island to finally recover remains, if they are her remains.
And that is a question that has been presented for people who think that this investigation, when initially happened, was not done to the full extent that it should have been done. Many people wonder whether or not, if this crime or her disappearance happened in the States, would we have had an answer sooner? You're dealing with a foreign jurisdiction, foreign law enforcement, foreign investigators. We don't have Joseph Scott Morgan investigating this back in the day. My final question to you, because I know we have to let you go, is if this is NATALEE's remains, it would provide a sense of closure for the family. In general, we see a lot of times families, when there is a disappearance and we know that there's a killer, they'll offer, I'll tell you where the remains are, for a leniency in some sort of sentencing, or they know where the remains are. There's people who want to know the remains. I'm sure you've dealt with families before who need to find that body. No matter what, even if they don't have an answer about what happened, they need to find the body. My final question is, for their family, how important is this just to know that we found her?
Jesse, I started my career with the coroner's office in the Metro New Orleans area. I finished up my career as a senior investigator with the Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office in Atlanta. And out of all the cases that I worked, the gruesome cases that I'm sure many people can imagine, the things that I saw and that my colleagues saw, the one thing that really tugged at your heart consistently, and that we were we were privy to see that no one else were the tears of the family. And it's doubly painful when they have no one, but they know something horrible has happened. I have borne witness. I've been in the presence of families when skeletal remains were returned to them after being found for having been gone for years and years. And there is almost a palpable, a sensible appearance of peace that comes over them. The grief is still there, but this idea that they have something finally to pay their respects to, because we're, by nature, we're tactile creatures. We have to reach out and touch and see and experience in order to know that person's gone. How many times over the years have you heard people say they've lost someone, they weren't there when it happened? I just can't believe they're gone. That's in our nature. That's part of who we are as people. And I think that this will be a huge healing for this family, a huge healing for all of her friends. And I would imagine all the people that have put in an investigative efforts into this. I'm also hoping one more thing. If this is her, I'm hoping that the family and the powers that be, maybe legislators, will wield this with our State Department as leverage with the Aruban government to begin to move forward with a real investigation into this case and hopefully a prosecution at some point in time.
Joseph Scott Morgan, very well said. That was very well said. I hope so too. I agree with you, and hopefully they receive some answers and we all receive some answers. So again, thank you so much. We had Joseph Scott Morgan, Distinguished Scholar of Applied Forensics at Jacksonville State University. Thank you so much.
You bet, Jesse.
Take care. Well, there you have it.